Some people are born with power, others fight for it. And then there are those who believe they have inherited it without ever knowing its true price. Lucas Schneider belonged to the latter category, a young man of just 26 whose life was confined to a golden cage of privilege and illusions. He controlled a financial network that spanned 3 states, sat on the supervisory boards of 2 medium-sized companies, and had connections that reached into the highest circles of the German business elite. But all this glamour couldn't hide what he really was, a spoiled heir who had never learned that boundaries exist. On that November evening in the year 2014, Lucas raced down the highway near Frankfurt, accompanied by 4 of his closest confidants, men he generously paid to indulge his whims and protect his arrogance. The motorcade consisted of a black Mercedes S-Class, in which Lucas himself was sitting, followed by a dark grey BMW X5, in which his so-called security guards had taken their seats. The night was cold, the sky overcast, and the streets glistened wet from the drizzle that had been falling on the city for hours. But Lucas didn't care about the weather. His head was full of thoughts about the business meeting he had just finished. Another triumph in an endless series of successes that had never really belonged to him. His father, Klaus Schneider, was a legend in certain circles. For decades, he had served as a high-ranking official in the Federal Criminal Police Office, a man who solved cases before they even became public. His career was marked by discretion, efficiency, and a network of contacts that spanned the whole of Europe. After retiring, Klaus had not enjoyed his retirement, but had used his knowledge and connections to set up a consulting firm that worked for both corporations and government agencies. The company flourished, and with it the Schneider family's fortune grew. Lucas had grown up in this environment, surrounded by men in expensive suits who whispered when they talked about business and laughed when they talked about their opponents. He had learned early on that power did not have to be loud to be effective, but he had also learned that money could solve almost any problem. His teenage years had been a string of privileges. Private schools, stays abroad, a degree from an elite university that he endured rather than earned, and finally a position in his father's company that fell to him automatically without him ever really having to qualify for it. Lucas was intelligent, no one could deny that, but his intelligence was unpolished, unbridled, and above all, dangerous. He had never learned to deal with frustration because he had never really experienced it. If something in his life didn't work out, his father made sure it disappeared. A bad report card? No problem. A dispute with a lecturer? Done. A charge of assault after a bar fight? Never went to court. These patterns had solidified over the years until Lucas had become a man who believed the world would bend to his will. He surrounded himself with people who never contradicted him, who treated his whims as commands, and who were willing to do things for him that he didn't want to do himself. His 4 companions that evening were just such men. Dennis Schroeder, a former bouncer with an impressive physique and an IQ barely above room temperature. Simon Langer, a former police cadet who had failed due to disciplinary violations and now channeled his frustration into blind obedience to Lucas. Fabian Vogt, a gym owner who was constantly in need of money and willing to sell his morals for it. And finally, Patrick Albrecht, the youngest of the group, a man in his mid-20s who had known Lucas since school and had never found the courage to break away from him. The journey was uneventful at first. The convoy moved through the night at excessive speeds, ignoring speed limits and pushing other vehicles aside as if they were mere obstacles on a private racetrack. Lucas sat in the back seat of his Mercedes, smartphone in hand, scrolling through messages with boredom, while his driver, a quiet man named Christoph Koenig, kept his eyes focused on the road. Music played softly, an electronic beat that kept the atmosphere in the car cool and distant. Lucas seemed relaxed, almost bored, as if he had already experienced 1,000 such nights and expected nothing new. But then a silver Volkswagen Passat appeared in front of them, an inconspicuous vehicle moving at a constant speed in the middle lane. Christoph slowed down slightly to keep his distance, but Lucas immediately noticed the delay. He looked up, frowned, and pointed forward with his finger. "Get closer," he said in a voice that brooked no contradiction. Christoph hesitated for a moment, but then followed the instruction. The Mercedes moved closer to the Passat, its headlights glaring in the rearview mirror of the car in front. But the Passat did not change its speed, remained in its lane, and continued driving with the same calm, almost stubborn consistency. Lucas felt irritation rising within him. He wasn't used to being ignored. "Honk the horn," he ordered, and Christoph obeyed. The horn sounded loud and aggressive, an unmistakable signal. But the Passat didn't react. Lucas leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "What kind of idiot is this?" he muttered, more to himself than to Christoph. He grabbed his cell phone and dialed the number of Simon Lang, who was driving the BMW behind them. "We've got a clown here who won't move out of the way," Lucas said, his voice now sharper, tinged with dangerous impatience. "Get closer. Show him he needs to move." The BMW accelerated and pulled into the left lane, overtaking the Mercedes and positioning itself directly next to the Passat. Simon rolled down his window and gestured wildly, shouting something that was lost in the night. But the driver of the Passat, a middle-aged man with grey hair and a calm expression, didn't even glance to the side. He kept his eyes fixed on the road, his hands firmly on the steering wheel, as if he were trapped in his own world. This stoic calm only made Lucas angrier. He couldn't understand why this man wouldn't comply, why he wouldn't just pull over and make room for him. It was as if the Passat driver was deliberately provoking him, as if he were questioning Lucas's authority. The highway led through an industrial area, past dark warehouses and deserted parking lots. The lighting was sparse, with only a few streetlights casting a pale light on the asphalt. It was shortly after midnight, and the traffic had almost disappeared. Perfect conditions for what happened next. Lucas gave another command, this time more direct, more cold. "Force him to stop. I want to talk to this guy." The BMW and Mercedes worked together to encircle the Passat. The BMW cut in front of the Passat and braked abruptly, while the Mercedes pulled up close behind. The Passat driver had no choice but to brake as well to avoid a collision. Slowly, all three vehicles rolled onto the shoulder until they finally came to a stop. The night was suddenly silent. Only the soft hum of the engines and the patter of rain on the roofs could be heard. Lucas got out of the Mercedes, the door slamming behind him. The cold of the night hit him immediately, but he hardly felt it. His four companions followed him, forming a threatening group around the Passat. The driver was still sitting behind the wheel, not moving, just staring straight ahead. Lucas approached the driver's door and knocked on the window with his knuckles. "Get out," he said, his voice cutting. "Immediately." The man in the Passat did not react immediately. He seemed to be thinking, weighing things up. Then slowly he opened the door and got out. He was about 50 years old, average height, grey hair, wearing thin metal-rimmed glasses. His clothes were unremarkable, dark jeans and a worn leather jacket. He looked like someone who led a simple life, someone who didn't look for trouble. But there was a calmness in his eyes that irritated Lucas. "Who do you think you are?" Lucas snapped at him, his voice loud and aggressive. "I honk my horn, I signal, and you just ignore me? Do you know who I am?" The man looked calmly at Lucas without answering. This silence only made Lucas angrier. He took a step closer, his fist clenching unconsciously. "Answer me when I'm talking to you." The man shook his head slightly, as if accepting a sad truth. "You should go home," he said quietly, his voice almost gentle. "You won't like this." Those words, spoken so calmly and almost pityingly, caused something to explode inside Lucas. Without thinking, without hesitation, he swung and punched the man in the face. The blow was hard, clumsy, but effective. The man's glasses flew to the side, his nose began to bleed. He stumbled backward but quickly regained his balance. But he didn't raise his hands to defend himself, he just stood there bleeding, and looked at Lucas with an expression that showed neither fear nor anger, but something Lucas couldn't quite place: pity. The four men around Lucas reacted immediately. Dennis grabbed the man by the arm and pulled him aside. Simon and Fabian stepped closer, their bodies forming a threatening wall. Patrick hesitated, standing slightly apart, his face pale. What Lucas didn't know, what he couldn't possibly have known at that moment, was that the man in front of him was Sebastian Brown, a retired detective superintendent who had served in the police force for over 30 years. A man who had seen more violence in his life than Lucas could ever imagine. A man who had 2 adult sons, one of whom, Jonas Braun, also worked for the police and was sitting in a police station less than 100 kilometers away at that very moment. Sebastian said nothing more. He knew that words would have no effect here. He memorized faces, details, the license plate of the Mercedes. And he waited. The violence that followed was swift and brutal. Dennis knocked him down, Fabian kicked him, Simon ripped open the door of the Passat and began to vandalize the interior. Lucas stood by, watching with a mixture of satisfaction and boredom, as if it were just another inconvenience that had to be dealt with. After a few minutes, it was over. Sebastian lay on the ground, bleeding but conscious. His car was demolished, the windows smashed, the side mirror torn off. Lucas took one last look at the man, then turned and walked back to his Mercedes. "Let's get out of here," he said to Christoph, as if nothing had happened. The convoy set off, disappearing into the night, leaving behind only a wrecked car and an injured man. But Sebastian Braun did not remain alone for long. He reached for his phone, which was lying on the passenger seat, and dialed a number. His son answered after the second ring. "Jonas," Sebastian said in a calm but firm voice, "I need your help." And then he began to tell his story. What Lucas had done that night would prove to be the biggest mistake of his life. He had not only attacked a man, but a father whose son had access to resources far beyond what money could buy. He had crossed a line that was invisible but absolute, and the consequences would not be long in coming. Jonas Braun was sitting in his office at Frankfurt Police Headquarters when his father's phone rang. It was shortly after midnight, a time when Sebastian was usually fast asleep. The tone of his father's voice immediately caught Jonas's attention. Calm, controlled, but with a sharpness he rarely heard. As Sebastian recounted the events, Jonas took notes, his hand moving quickly across the paper. License plate number, vehicle type, number of perpetrators, physical descriptions. When the conversation ended, Jonas leaned back and stared at his notes. His father had taught him never to act impulsively. 30 years of police work had made Sebastian a man who combined patience with precision. Jonas had internalized this lesson. He was 32 years old, a detective inspector in the organized crime division, and had earned a reputation as a methodical, incorruptible investigator. His colleagues respected him, his superiors trusted him, and his network extended deep into various agencies. Jonas picked up the phone and called 3 people. The first was Matthias Otto, a colleague from the traffic police who had access to all license plate databases. The second was Kai Peters, an investigator with the State Criminal Police Office who specialized in white-collar crime. The third was Benedict Schmidt, an experienced prosecutor known for his tough stance on offenders from privileged backgrounds. Within 2 hours, Jonas had a complete picture. The Mercedes belonged to Lucas Schneider, son of Klaus Schneider, a former high-ranking BKA official. The vehicle was registered to a company that was part of a complex network of companies. Kai Peters provided further details. Lucas sat on the supervisory boards of several companies. controlled holdings in various firms, and moved in circles where money and influence went hand in hand. Matthias found out that the Mercedes had already been involved in 3 traffic violations in the last 6 months: speeding, aggressive driving, coercion. Each time, the proceedings had been dropped without charges being filed. Jonas shared the information with Benedikt Schmidt. The prosecutor listened attentively, asked precise questions, and took his own notes. When Jonas was finished, Benedikt was silent for a moment. Then he said, "This is not an easy case. The Schneider family has connections. If we take this on, we have to do everything right. No mistakes, no gaps." Jonas nodded. He knew what Benedikt was getting at. Cases against influential people required absolute care. Any procedural error, any missing documentation could cause the case to collapse. But Jonas also had something that many investigators didn't have: personal motivation. His father was in the hospital with a broken nose, bruises, and a concussion. The doctors had said it could have been worse, but that didn't change the fact that Sebastian had been attacked, brutally, and without reason. The next morning, Jonas arranged for the surveillance videos from the highway to be secured. The cameras had only partially captured the scene, but it was enough to identify the motorcade and confirm the time of the incident. Jonas also ordered the vehicles to be seized. This required a court order, which Benedikt obtained within a few hours. The reasoning was simple: suspicion of aggravated assault, coercion in traffic, and property damage. The search took place on the 3rd day after the incident. Jonas personally led the operation. 6 plainclothes officers drove to the address where the Mercedes was registered, an exclusive estate in an affluent suburb of Frankfurt. Lukas was not at home, but his father Klaus opened the door. He was a man in his late 60s, well-groomed, with sharp eyes and an air of authority. When Jonas presented the search warrant, Klaus scanned the document with a calm expression. "This is a misunderstanding," Klaus said in a firm voice. "My son was at a business meeting that evening. He didn't do anything." Jonas remained polite but firm. "We'll sort this out, Mr. Schneider. Right now, we need to secure the vehicles and ask a few questions." Klaus tried to make a phone call, presumably to seek legal assistance, but Jonas wouldn't let him stop. The officers searched the property, confiscated the Mercedes, and took Lucas's cell phone, which they found in his room. In addition, the 4 men who had been there that night were summoned for questioning. Dennis Schröder, Simon Lang, Fabian Vogt, and Patrick Albrecht all received official summonses within 24 hours. The interrogations began a week later. Jonas conducted them personally, assisted by 2 colleagues. Dennis Schröder was the first to arrive. He was nervous, sweating despite the cool room temperature, and avoided Jonas's gaze. Jonas asked simple questions, presented the video recordings, and mentioned his father's testimony. Dennis tried to deny everything, but his story had gaps. After 2 hours, he broke down and confessed his involvement. He accused Lukas of having orchestrated everything. Simon Lang and Fabian Vogt followed similar patterns. Both initially tried to shift the blame, but when confronted with the statements of the others, they gave in. Only Patrick Albrecht remained silent. He refused to make any statement, sat with his arms crossed, and stared at the table. Jonas let him go, knowing that the other 3 statements were sufficient. Lukas himself was not questioned until 2 weeks after the incident. He appeared with 2 lawyers, elegantly dressed and confident. He denied any involvement, claiming that his employees had acted without his consent. Jonas listened, took notes, and asked precise questions. When Lukas claimed that he had tried to stop the men, Jonas presented cell phone data showing that Lukas had made several calls during the incident, coordinating, not preventing. The lawyers intervened, demanded a recess, threatened to file complaints, but Jonas remained calm. He had had enough. Benedict Schmidt officially filed charges: aggravated assault, coercion, property damage. The trial would begin in 3 months, but Jonas knew that this was only the beginning. Klaus Schneider would not stand idly by. The fight had only just begun. Klaus Schneider spent the first few days after the search activating his network. Phone calls were made, discreet meetings arranged, old favors called in. For over 30 years, he had built relationships, helped people, solved problems. Now it was time to cash in on those investments. His first call was to Volker Berger, a retired judge with whom he had worked on several sensitive cases in the 1990s. Volker listened to Klaus's account and promised to discreetly make inquiries. The second contact was Stefan Horn, an influential lawyer who specialized in commercial law and had connections to the judiciary. Stefan analyzed the files and shook his head thoughtfully. "The evidence is problematic, Klaus. 3 witnesses directly incriminate your son. The video recordings show the vehicle pursuit, and the victim is no stranger, a retired chief inspector with an impeccable reputation." Klaus frowned. There must be a way. Procedural errors, formal deficiencies, anything. Stefan was silent for a moment. "I'll take a closer look at the documents, but I advise you to prepare for a trial. And Lucas should show remorse, publicly, credibly." But Lucas showed no remorse. When Klaus spoke to him, his son reacted irritably and dismissively. "That's ridiculous," Lucas said, leaning back in his chair. "The guy got in my way. What was I supposed to do? Apologize because he was too proud to move out of the way?" Klaus lost his patience for the first time. "You don't understand the situation you're in. This isn't a traffic offense that will just go away. You attacked a former police officer and his son is leading the investigation. They want to make an example of you." Lucas waved him off. "Then let them try. We have the better lawyers, and if necessary we'll pay. Someone will cave in." This arrogance deeply disturbed Klaus. He recognized in his son a mistake he himself had made, the conviction that power and money could overcome any boundary. But Klaus had learned, in the course of his career, that there were boundaries, invisible lines that must not be crossed. Lucas had never learned this lesson because Klaus had protected him from it. In the weeks that followed, Klaus tried to put pressure on the public prosecutor's office. He contacted former colleagues and spoke to officials who still owed him a favor. Some listened politely and promised to look into the matter, but no one took any concrete steps. Benedict Schmidt, the prosecutor in charge, was known for his incorruptibility. He had handled several high-profile cases against influential people in the past, and won every time. Klaus quickly realized that Schmidt was not the kind of man who could be influenced by favors or subtle threats. Jonas Brown also proved to be impenetrable. Klaus tried to make contact through intermediaries, offering to settle the matter out of court and talking about compensation and reparations. But Jonas rejected every offer. For him, this was not a negotiation, but a question of justice. His father was still in the hospital, recovering slowly, and every time Jonas visited him, his determination grew stronger. The trial began on a cold February day, 3 months after the incident. The courtroom was packed. Journalists had gotten wind of the case, and the media reported on the son of the former FBI agent and the brutal assault on the highway. Klaus sat in the front row, his face expressionless, while Lucas took his place at the defense table with his 3 lawyers. The prosecution presented its evidence systematically. Video recordings, witness statements, medical reports on Sebastian's injuries. Dennis, Simon, and Fabian testified, each of them incriminating Lucas heavily. The defense tried to undermine their credibility, portraying them as unreliable witnesses who wanted to minimize their own guilt. But their statements were consistent, detailed, and supported by objective evidence. Sebastian Brown appeared as a witness. He spoke calmly, precisely, without emotion. He described the events objectively, describing Lucas's behavior, the blows, the destruction of his vehicle. He remained unshaken under cross-examination. The defense tried to insinuate that he had provoked the attack, but Sebastian stuck to his story. "I just drove, nothing more." After 2 weeks of trial, the verdict was handed down. Guilty on all counts. Lucas Schneider was sentenced to 2 years in prison, suspended on probation, along with a heavy fine and community service. It was a lenient sentence, influenced by Lucas's previous clean record and the fact that he himself had not directly struck anyone. But for Klaus, it was humiliating. For Lucas, it was a shock. And for Jonas, it was only the beginning. Lucas left the courtroom with a fixed stare. Cameras flashed, journalists shouted questions, but he ignored it all. His lawyers formed a protective wall around him, while Klaus walked silently beside him. 2 years probation, community service, a fine of 50,000 euros. For most people, that would have been a harsh punishment. For Lucas, it felt like a public execution. In the days following the verdict, Lucas's situation deteriorated dramatically. The media coverage was relentless. Newspapers printed photos of him, analyzed his lifestyle, and spoke of affluenza and privileged violence. Social media platforms exploded with comments, most of them hostile. His phone number was leaked, as was his address. Hate messages filled his mailbox, some of them threatening. The business consequences were not long in coming. The 2 companies on whose supervisory boards Lucas sat discreetly asked him to resign. His position was no longer tenable, the board members explained in polite but unambiguous letters. The company's image had to be protected. Lucas signed the letters of resignation with a trembling hand, feeling for the first time in his life how power was dissolving. Klaus tried to limit the damage. He reactivated his contacts, tried to influence media coverage, and placed positive stories. But the wave was already too big. Some of his old connections distanced themselves, stopped answering his calls, and cancelled planned meetings. Klaus realized with growing bitterness that his influence had limits he had never noticed before. Jonas Brown followed the developments with sober satisfaction. But he wasn't done. During the investigation, he had noticed something: inconsistencies in the finances of the companies Lucas was associated with. Small discrepancies, suspicious transactions, constructs that seemed designed to conceal money. Jonas had passed this information on to Kai Peters, the specialist in white-collar crime. Kai began to dig deeper. He analyzed annual financial statements, tracked cash flows, and identified shell companies. What he found was a complex network of shell companies, offshore accounts, and intertwined shareholdings. It was difficult to prove that anything illegal was going on, but there was enough evidence to justify an official investigation. Kai submitted a report to the public prosecutor's office. 3 months after the verdict, Lucas received another summons. This time, it was not about the assault on the highway, but about suspected tax evasion and money laundering. Lucas read the letter several times, unable to believe what it said. He immediately called Stefan Horn, the lawyer who had represented him in the first trial. Stefan was alarmed. "This is serious, Lucas. Economic crimes are often punished more severely than violent crimes, especially when large sums of money are involved. We have to compile all the documents and be able to justify every transaction." But as Stefan went through the documents, he realized that the situation was more complicated than he had thought. Many of the structures had been set up by Klaus long before Lucas was involved, but formally they were registered in Lucas's name. Stefan confronted Klaus with this, who showed signs of nervousness for the first time. "These were legal tax-saving models," Klaus said defensively. "None of this is illegal. That depends on how the prosecution interprets it," Stefan replied coolly. "And right now, they have every reason to be critical." The investigation dragged on for months. Tax investigators searched offices, confiscated computers, and interrogated employees. Every week brought new revelations. Newspapers reported on concealed millions and systematic fraud. Klaus's consulting firm came under pressure. Clients terminated contracts, and new orders failed to materialize. Lucas fell into a downward spiral. He hardly slept, lost weight, and isolated himself. His few remaining friends avoided him. No one wanted to be seen with a man who was at the center of a financial scandal. Even Patrick Albrecht, the only one who had remained silent during the first trial, distanced himself. Lucas had to perform the community service he had been sentenced to in a homeless shelter. A deliberate humiliation that reminded him every day of how far he had fallen. Klaus desperately tried to salvage the situation. He offered to pay all back taxes, accept penalties, and disclose everything. But the prosecution was not interested in a deal. They wanted to send a message to make an example of him. Benedict Schmidt, who also led this investigation, was determined to see it through to the end. A year after the first verdict, Lucas was brought to trial again. This time, the charge was tax evasion in a particularly serious case. The evidence was overwhelming. Millions of euros that had been withheld from the tax authorities over many years. The defense argued that Lucas had only been a frontman, that his father had created the structures, but the court saw it differently. Lucas had signed the documents, had benefited from the schemes, had never asked any questions. The verdict was harsher than the first time, 3 years in prison without parole. Lucas collapsed in the courtroom. His lawyers had to support him. Klaus sat there petrified, his face ashen. The cameras captured everything. 2 weeks later, Lucas was transferred to the Frankfurt-Prongesheim prison. There, behind bars, he began to understand for the first time what he had lost. The first few weeks in Prongesheim were torture for Lucas. The cell measured 9 square meters and was shared with a fellow inmate named Jens Dietrich, a man in his mid-40s who was serving time for drug trafficking. Jens watched Lucas with a mixture of amusement and contempt. He immediately recognized what Lucas was, a spoiled boy who had never experienced real hardship. Everyday prison life systematically ground Lucas down. Wake-up call at 6 in the morning, breakfast in the crowded canteen, work in the prison laundry, where he performed monotonous tasks 8 hours a day. The other inmates treated him with open hostility. They had read the newspaper reports and knew who he was. For them, Lucas was the symbol of everything they hated: wealth, privilege, arrogance. In the 3rd week the first incident occurred. 3 inmates surrounded Lucas in the yard and pushed him into a corner. One of them, a burly man with scars on his face, stepped close to him. "You think you're better than us, don't you? Think your daddy will buy you out of here?" Lucas tried to answer, but his voice failed him. The man punched him in the face, not hard enough to cause serious injury, but hard enough to knock Lucas to the ground. The guards only intervened when it was already over. Lucas spent the night in the infirmary with a laceration above his eye and bruises all over his body. Klaus visited him 2 days later. He looked older, his face lined with worry. They sat across from each other in a sparse visiting room, separated by a plexiglass screen. Lucas could hardly look at his father. "How are you?" Klaus asked quietly. "How should I be?" Lucas replied bitterly. "I'm in here while everything is falling apart outside." Klaus was silent for a moment. "I'm working on a revision. Stefan is reviewing all the options. We'll get through this." But in Klaus's eyes, Lucas saw something he had never seen before: doubt. His father, who had always had solutions, who had always known how to solve problems, was at a loss. The machinery they had set in motion could no longer be stopped. Outside, the situation continued to deteriorate. The media had reported on Lucas's transfer to prison, on the incidents there, on his breakdown. Klaus's company lost its last remaining customers. The public prosecutor's office expanded its investigation, this time to include Klaus himself. The constructs he had created were now classified as a criminal organization. Jonas Brown followed the developments with sober detachment. His father Sebastian had long since recovered and resumed his life, but Jonas had discovered something else, a pattern. During the investigation against Lucas, 3 other cases had come to light in which young men from wealthy families had committed similar assaults. All 3 cases had been dropped without explanation and without consequences. Jonas began to reopen these cases. In his cell, Lucas sat on the narrow cot and stared at the grey wall. 3 years, 1,990 days. He had stopped counting after the first few weeks. Time lost its meaning, turning into an endless present with no future. At night he heard the sounds of the prison, screams, footsteps, the clattering of bars. And he thought of that November evening, the silver Passat, the man with the glasses whose face he would never forget. Sebastian Brown. The name haunted him. Lucas had never understood why this man hadn't fought back, why he had just stood there and looked at him with that calm, almost pitying gaze. Now, in the silence of his cell, he began to understand. Sebastian had known that violence was not the strongest weapon. Patience, justice, the system, those were the tools that really destroyed. And Lucas was slowly being destroyed. 2 years and 4 months after his imprisonment, Lucas Schneider was released early. Good behavior, therapy sessions, a positive assessment from the prison psychologist. All of this had led to a reduction in his sentence. But the man who walked through the prison door was no longer the same man who had once raced down the highway at excessive speed. Lucas had lost 40 pounds. His face was gaunt, his eyes empty. Klaus waited outside, aged and stooped. They embraced wordlessly, 2 broken men who didn't know how to put back together what had been lost. The world Lucas returned to no longer existed. Klaus's consulting firm had gone bankrupt, and the house in Frankfurt had been sold to pay off debts. They now lived in a small rented apartment in the suburbs, far removed from the splendor that had once defined their lives. Most of the furniture was second-hand, the walls bare. Klaus had taken a part-time job as a consultant for an insurance company, a job that would have seemed ridiculous to him in the past. Lucas tried to find work, but his criminal record made it impossible. Every application ended with a polite rejection. The few interviews he did get ended as soon as his name was Googled. The media reports remained online, permanent, indelible. His past was digitally preserved, an eternal memorial to his mistakes. 3 months after his release, Lucas received a letter. Sender, Sebastian Brown. His hands trembled as he opened the envelope. The letter was handwritten, the script precise and calm. Mr. Schneider, I am writing to you not out of vindictiveness, but out of a sense of completeness. What you did to me that evening was painful, but it wasn't the worst thing I've experienced in my life. The worst thing was seeing a young man believe he was above other people just because he had money and connections. You didn't just hurt me, you hurt yourself. I hope you have learned something over the past few years, not about laws or punishments, but about respect and humility. If you ever feel the need to talk about it, you can find me. Sebastian Brown. Lucas read the letter 3 times, then collapsed and cried for the first time in years. Klaus found him on the floor, the letter in his hand, and simply held him without saying a word. Jonas Brown had continued his work. The 3 other cases he had investigated led to new charges and further convictions. The system that had protected privileged perpetrators for years began to change. Jonas was promoted to chief detective, his name becoming synonymous with justice without regard to person. Sebastian returned to his quiet life, tending his garden, reading books, spending time with his grandchildren. The scars on his face had faded, but the memory remained. Sometimes he thought about that November evening, about the young man with the angry eyes. and he hoped that Lucas Schneider had indeed learned his lesson. Lucas himself eventually found work at a non-profit organization that helped former criminals reintegrate into society. It was modest work, poorly paid, but it gave him a sense of purpose. He talked to young people who had made similar mistakes, told them his story, warned them against the illusion of invincibility. One day, almost 4 years after that fateful evening, Lucas stood in front of a small house on the outskirts of town. He rang the doorbell, his hands clammy with nervousness. Sebastian Braun opened the door, older but with the same calm gaze. They stood facing each other, silence between them. Then Lucas said in a quiet voice, "I'm sorry. I'm so incredibly sorry." Sebastian nodded slowly. "I know. Come in." They sat together for 2 hours, talking about mistakes, consequences, forgiveness. When Lucas left, he felt something like peace for the first time in years. He would never get back what he had lost, but maybe he could build something new. The lesson had been painful, costly, destructive. But it had been learned. No one is above the law. No one is untouchable. And sometimes the hardest price to pay is not the punishment itself, but realizing who you really were and who you could have been.